Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcasts and YouTube videos. Glad to be back in the saddle here doing another interview. Many interviews coming up, but today I'm very excited. David Augustin, Dr. David Augustin, is here, and many of you may know him already because of his association with Word on Fire. He is the associate editor of Word on Fire Academic Press. So if any of you have sent manuscripts to Word on Fire, you may have had dealings with David Augustin. I've met you once in person, David. I believe that was at the Resourcement conference, or was there another time
Well, I
when
know
you
we
and
had dinner. I think we had dinner like twice at the new Resourcement conference last year.
yeah,
I've known you for a few years. I think somehow, but it's all a jumble, and so I don't remember when we met in person.
yeah. And I was, of course, at Mundelein for that the little meeting where we were honoring Edward Oakes.
Mm.
And you may have been at that conference that Matt Leverine and Bishop Barron. Well, he wasn't Bishop Barron then, you know. But anyway, it's neither here nor there. The reason why I'm having David on the show today, he finished his PhD in 2021 at Catholic University of America under the one and only the great Reinhard Hutter, who many of us know, and it just this past year at the Academy of Catholic Theology meeting in Washington D.C. It won the dissertation award, which is a rather, I mean, the Academy of Catholic Theology is nothing to sneeze at, and there's some heavyweights there. And therefore, for them to recognize your dissertation as being something of great merit caught my attention. But what really caught my attention was that your dissertation is on a figure whose star is rising, Matthias Scheeben, a priest, a 19th century theologian, who many would consider to be maybe the greatest Catholic theologian of the 19th century. And he is considered, I think, to be a sort of bridge figure between scholasticism and ressourcement thinking. Anyway, I don't want to steal your thunder too much here, but I want my viewers to be familiar with Matthias Scheeben. I'm trying to get an interview with Father Vincent Strand, Jesuit, who has also written some things on Scheeben. So I'm on a Scheeben kick lately, and I want my viewers and listeners to read more Scheeben. And his books are out there. You can buy them. They're a little pricey, but you can get them. But anyway, David's dissertation was called "Christ and the Altar Fire: Sacrifice as Deification in Matthias Scheeben," which is what we're going to talk about today. But anyway, thank you for being on the show, David.
You're welcome, Larry.
Good. Well, I'm glad you're here. And let's just begin at the beginning. Uh, who was Matthias Scheeben, and why should people care about him?
Okay, well, as I told Larry right before we went on the air, for anyone that's listening, I have to, in order to speak, I have everything in like my hard drive and I have to get it up into RAM. And I haven't read my, kind of dissertation slash book in a while. And
Yeah.
so we're gonna just start to work through this until it all kind of comes out. Shaban was born in 1835 and he died like too young, in my opinion, at in 1888 at I think he was 52 going on 53.
What did he
And
die from anyway? But I tried to figure that out.
oh, I'm not sure actually, just bad health.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I don't know that the medical diagnoses were that great during that time period either, but maybe Vincent Strand might know this. You mentioned him, and he's a good friend of mine, so we should ask him.
Okay.
But I think he knows a lot about Shaven too, and I usually go to him for questions because there's maybe half a dozen people on this continent that know a lot about Shaven right now, and we email each other. So
That's great. So anyway, I interrupted you. So continue on with the sort of brief biography of Scheeben.
So he was born in 1835, somewhere around the age of 17 or 18, as I recall. He left Germany around, so let's say around 1849, 1850, somewhere in there. And he was notably gifted. And the thing about Shaven was is that he is a genius, and you don't always have to agree with him, and I don't always agree with him, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he really is brilliant. And he was recognized for his talent, and he was sent to Rome to study at the Gregorianum, the Greg,
Yeah.
the Jesuit school there. And he studied with a number of like kind of synthetic figures called the Roman school. And there's been more scholarship on the Roman school lately. A good book on them is, I think it's by my buddy, the Jesuit Joseph Corolla, that came out with Emmaus. I want to say last year, and that goes through like a number of like 19th century figures, including Scheeben, and I think Carlo Passaglia is in there. And he studied at Rome until I want to say about 1859. And then he was sent back to Germany. He initially was like a confessor and I think a school teacher at a cloister, but then he was assigned to the Archdiocesan Seminary in Cologne around, I want to say 1861, 1862. And then he remained there for the rest of his life. He never held a position at a German university. The asterisk on all of this is in 1875, when, Otto von Bismarck was, carrying out his little Kulturkampf program, which was a state persecution of attempting to eliminate the Catholic Church in Germany. His seminary was shuttered. His bishop actually was arrested for a while, then he fled. Scheeben could have walked down the streets of Cologne, is my understanding, and seen pictures of his bishop as a wanted man. And his seminary was shuttered, and he stayed at the seminary for about a decade, just with it shuttered. And then I think they reopened mid 1880s, and then he kind of taught again for a little bit. Then he died. He was an incredibly prolific author. His first book was actually a collection of I think patristic poems on Mary, as I recall. His first major book was a book on nature and grace that came out, I want to say 1861, when he was about 25. His magnum opus, and so I work for Word and Fire Academic, and before we're done, maybe I'll show some of our books too. But
yes, please.
I'll also have to show some Emmaus books because I do work for them on the Scheeben stuff. So his major book, his early book, is The Mysteries of Christianity. And this is the new edition by Emmaus. And for those
there's a new edition. I have an old edition of that, and that's the only book of his
exactly the same.
Oh, okay.
The text and the pagination are exactly the same because we wanted to preserve that. And it's Cyril Volert's translation, which is really lovely. And for those of you who are listening maybe on the podcast and not on the YouTube feed or whatever, I was just showing the cover of the book on the screen.
Called Mysteries of Christianity. It's a classic text and well worth reading.
All 800 pages of it. So you have to know what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah.
And he published that when I think he was 29, and he had it in the Journal Der Catholique. He'd had it coming out for about 3 years prior to that as a series of preparatory studies. And so he's written one of the seminal works of modern Catholicism, and he published it before he was 30. So that, what are we doing with our lives, Larry?
I know.
I know.
Seriously, when I see something like that and you say 800 pages, wrote it when he was, 29 years old. And I'm going, geez, I struggle to crank out 1,500 words for something in Catholic World Report or something. It's crazy. Some people have the gift.
Yeah. And he didn't have word processors. Now, I've seen manuscripts where people used to do dissertations and books without word processors, and then they're leaving in space for footnotes, and then they're doing hand corrections on typed manuscripts. And I don't know I don't got that.
Well, let me tell you something. I am old enough to remember those days. And I don't want to sidetrack too far, but it does speak to his, how prolific he was. I mean, I wrote my master's thesis by hand, longhand, on a legal page. I always liked legal pages because a legal page in my script translated into one typed page, and it gave me a sense. And then I would count when I was typing it on a Smith Corona electric typewriter. I always had to measure at the bottom to make sure I left space for the footnotes, because I had some jerk professors that wouldn't let you do end notes. You had to do footnotes. And it really did cut into your creativity and cut into the volume of your output. You were constantly aware of how much work was involved just in the mechanics of it. So here's a guy in the 19th century, writing 800 pages like this. It's incredible.
And so his Mysteries came out in 1865, and he was always prolific, publishing journal articles. And around the time of, in 1869, 1870, he starts editing a number of journals over the course of the next decade, all dealing with the controversial issues surrounding, drumroll, the First Vatican Council. Because, we've been dealing with the reception and implementation of the Second Vatican Council for the last forever. And because councils are like this, are a mess historically. And he's dealing with the mess of the First Vatican Council. And, Scheeben was, as I recall, I think he was an inopportunist initially on papal infallibility, but then after it was defined, he went to bat for it. And I think that's kind of a little bit like where Newman was at too. And he's edited and published in a number of journals. And in some of these journals, the articles are unsigned. And there is, among Scheeben scholars, like in Germany, there is speculation that he may have written many or all of these unsigned articles. And so there's probably the extent of his journal output is not known.
Wow, it's
Um,
incredible.
and then around 1867, his friend Benjamin Herder from a publishing company, Herder and Herder, that you may have heard of, he
Oh
pitched the
yeah.
idea of the dogmatics to him. Scheeben initially thought about writing like kind of a moral dogmatics, but he thought the most pressing issues of the time at the time were in just like non-moral dogmatic theology. Now that's a whole nother question about how moral theology became separated from dogmatic theology, because morals are just in the middle of Thomas's Summa because it's how we return to God. But that's
Yeah.
neither here
Yeah.
nor there.
Never mind. Yeah. I was just talking with my friend David Dean, the theologian, about how moral theology got detached from dogmatic theology. And it's one of the great tragic stories of modern theology. But let's go back then to the title of your okay. That's Scheeben's basic biography. He lived in interesting times, tumultuous times. He had to deal with the controversial ecumenical council, like we're dealing with the controversial ecumenical council. But in the midst of it all, he produced a rather profound set of dogmatic theological writings. Now, your dissertation is called Christ and the Altar Fire. And I've read the introduction and the conclusion to your dissertation, and there's a couple of chapters in the middle that I also read. And the concept of the altar fire, as you lay it out and then relate it to sacrifices, deification, is profoundly interesting to me. And it's interesting that Scheeben saw this, so I think, very presciently, and is therefore a kind of a bridge figure into Resourcement theology, it seems to me. But anyway, talk about Christ and the altar fire, and what that's all about. If you can recall what you wrote.
Oh, I no, no. Like I have notes here that I had to put
I'm
together.
sorry I made you go through all this.
No,
Sorry.
Larry, this is how I work though. Like when I write something, I have my notes and everything, and then it gets on the page, and then I close the book. Next, and then
Yeah.
oh, what did I write? I can't even remember what I wrote, so I always have to like go back to it and revisit it. So I guess I can talk about this in a couple of ways. I
Okay.
could talk about kind of how I'm positioned in the book. I could talk about how I came to the book, and maybe I'll start there actually,
Yes, let's do that.
because I mean, just part of it's just it kind of flowed out of my personal biography. So I became a Christian when I was 24, and I became a Catholic when I was 27. Um, and when I read old books, and that kind of brought me into the Catholic Church. Although there's a bit more to it than that. In 2009, I was reading Augustine's City of God. And I get to book 10 where he's got the famous passages on sacrifice in book 10 where he's talking about sacrifice. I'm paraphrasing, but as essentially motion towards the good. And I didn't have the tools to understand that. I'd always thought of sacrifice as okay, so God's angry, so then you like kill an animal, and the animal somehow stands in for you, and that somehow diverts God's anger, and then something, 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 right? And I
Yeah.
didn't have the kind
Yeah.
of conceptual framework to have a more profound understanding than that. And so, and then something, something, the sacrifice of our head, and then the whole kind of mystical body united with Christ in the Eucharist, and this is the I didn't have the tools to understand any of that language. I started working on a very amateurish book on sacrifice, which will so the version that you have in your hands that you read, that's like recension 7 or 8 of this book. And the dissertation is much longer. And this is a proto version of the version I think that's going to be published by Mace Academic next year. I think it is.
I hope it is. It's really good. It's really good.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you like it. I have a complicated relationship to everything I write, but I'm glad other people like it.
Oh, I hate everything I write, David.
Oh, I do
I
too.
absolutely hate everything I
I
write.
hate everything I
I
write.
send it out and I'll say to my various editors, I hope you even this piece of garbage I just sent you, I apologize for it, and then it ends up going viral and people all over the world are
I know.
like, what? Those dribblings? Are you insane? Oh my God. But anyway,
hopefully other people find value in what I've moved on, just etc.
no,
Okay.
let me tell you something. There's tremendous insight. I know you're your own worst critic, but there's tremendous insight here in the notion of sacrifice as relating not to something, a cliche, not to something negative, but to something more positive. Sacrifice relates to deification, not to propitiating an angry God who is somehow not going to be appeased until he gets his pound of animal flesh or something.
Although of course, there's a propitiatory moment though too.
Yes, and yeah, as soon as that word came out of my mouth, I thought, well, yeah, there is a propitiatory moment, and so I don't want to, but there's a kind of way of conceiving propitiation as the assuaging the anger of a kind of vengeful God who isn't going to be, in a sense, turned back towards us until something suffers. Yes,
Yeah.
you get this caricature. But anyway, so what is the significance then of the altar fire and the notion of sacrifice in the Old Testament that you're trying to unpack here?
Well, so where I would start here is, when you look at like Old Testament sacrifice, that's going to be your sort of like your typological point of departure to understand the sort of the kinds of transpositional moves we need to make to apply everything to Christ, the work of the Spirit to the human being.
Yeah.
And the Old Testament gives us just the necessary sort of like visual grammar. It's our pedagogue. It gives us the necessary visual grammar. We need to start to make more abstract moves so we can talk about maybe like the action of grace on the soul, for example. And when you look at the Old Testament rights, and look, I want to be very clear about this. Scheeben, I mean, he has got intent, sort of like really sustained exegesis of like Old Testament texts and his dogmatics and so forth, and he really pays a lot of attention to this. But I mean, his reading of it is being governed by like kind of the rule of faith as he's received it, and his understanding of Christianity, and his understanding of who Christ is, what he does, the nature of the mechanics of the supernatural. All of this informs his reading of Old Testament texts, and everything kind of synchronically hangs together for him. That's how Scheeben's going to approach something like this. And so he reads the Old Testament text with an eye to the tradition, Catholic tradition, as he received it and understands it. And what he is looking at there is he's going to look at the different moments in the Old Testament sacrificial rites, and he thinks the key to understanding them that unlocks their significance for the New Testament is the act of ritual burn. So that's the first point. And so and this is, he's not alone here. There's any number of modern interpreters. I'm thinking of like Christian Eberhard. I'm thinking of like David Moffat. There's any number of contemporary interpreters who are actually moving along the same lines as him. If you read Odo Kazel's making some of these moves back in the 20th century,
Yeah.
Maurice de la Tailles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I've read Moffat and I've read Otto
Ratzinger too, actually, in the Spirit of the Liturgy. He's got a lot of the same stuff as Scheeben.
Yeah, you bring that up in an article you wrote for Otto Remus, I think, where you talk about.
Oh God, I forgot about that. That was a long time ago.
Yeah, ages ago.
That's juvenilia. So let's.
We won't bring it up.
No,
but anyway, I keep interrupting you, so go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think us talking is more interesting than me talking because you're very interested, and I regard you as my friend, by the way. So.
Oh, and you are my friend too. Yes.
Yeah, so anyway, so I like talking to my friends. And now we just happen to be filming it and putting it out to the public, and that's a whole different like dynamic, which we will have to.
Well, that's the way so many of my podcasts are. It's my theological friends, and I sit down and we have chats, and I think that's kind of what people like. It's not an interrogation, it's not a grilling, it's not a debate. It's like two dudes over a cup of tea or whatever, chit chatting about theology.
Yeah. Okay, so ritual burning. So Scheeben thinks that the ritual burning is the key to understand the Old Testament sacrifices. And there's any number of like modern interpreters who are actually making the same, and I don't think a lot of them have even read Scheeben, but they're making a lot of the same moves he is. So he's not operating in kind of like an interpretive vacuum here. So that's the first move. The second move is he thinks that like in the New Testament, what would they burn? Like animals and grain and things like that. God doesn't want animals per se. And insofar as you offered the animal, it was a sign of maybe like, your own gift of yourself, certain spiritual dispositions, your need for repentance and different things like that. Your contrition.
Yeah.
It was a matter that gave expression and, and kind of, which was informed, so to speak, by your different spiritual dispositions. So, but he thinks that the res or the sacrificial victim that they would offer, that was a sign or a stand-in ultimately for you as a human being, Larry. God wants you, ultimately. And the sacrificial action that is required is ultimately a kind of ritual burning. And that can have a purgative moment for Scheeben if you need purification. So, Larry, you're a terrible, incorrigible sinner, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to be, you have to be purified, and your soul has to pass through certain states so it can rise up to God. And this would correspond then to like medicinal grace. But Scheeben sees the fire as a type of grace in different ways: grace, charity, and glory in the New Testament. So you're the victim that God wants, and then you get consumed by the action of the grace that's poured out by Jesus Christ, and then you become a living sacrificial victim consumed by the fire of the Holy Spirit and so forth. And so then, if you need to go through some purification, then that's fine. Then the fire, it can it takes a dross on a piece of metal and it makes it shiny, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It can serve a purifying function. But then there's that elevating grace, which deifies you, because God doesn't just want to make you a better human being. He wants to make you God, as the church fathers used to say. And to Larry's listeners, I don't know what I mean. I'm not moving to some weird pantheistic realm here. We just become gods by participation. We partake of God, and that's what that mystery that we talk about, grace. And then faith and glory in the mind, and then charity in the will, and so forth and so on. It transforms us interiorly so that we come to share in God, just as a piece of metal, is put into fire and it takes on the
Yeah.
properties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you get into
I
all
think,
the,
yeah, I think most of my viewers are aware that when we say things like divinization or theosis, we certainly don't mean that, we are hypostatically united with the Godhead in the same way that the humanity of Jesus was. No, nobody thinks that. At least I hope nobody thinks that. Um, but anyway, keep going.
and so he's going to interpret the Old Testament rites, though, kind of through that framework. Is ultimately the goal is to be like what the goal of the burnt offering is in the Old Testament, and the burnt offering is a sort of paradigmatic sacrifice, and so that you rise up as an odor of sweetness, and then you become like this. You're purified. That's fine, but then ultimately you're sublated, and you turn into that smoke, into a lighter and finer form of yourself that rises up to God to be in His presence, and that's ultimately what He wants, and that's the goal of sacrifice: is your communion with God. In the
Yeah.
beatific and all that, and then the fire of charity. And so it has a perfective orientation. So that's kind of step one.
Yeah.
Now we go in a couple of different directions there. Now, part of it too is he's going to look at like a key text for his Leviticus chapter 9. And in Leviticus chapter 9, that's where they have the inauguration of the priestly cult. The Aaronic priests are ordained. And then they light a fire on the altar. But then, the Kabod Yahweh, the glory of God shows up, the Shekinah, the pillar of
Yeah.
cloud and fire type figure, the luminous cloud that manifests God's presence in the Old Testament, that shows the sign of his indwelling in the temple. That shows up, and then fire shoots forth from it. That seems to be the prominent reading of the text in Leviticus 9, although there's complexities. And then it consumes the gift on the altar fire. And then that's the gift, that's the fire that Israel's told to keep perpetually burning. Oh, Shaven's going, okay, well, we have like the pillar of cloud and fire. That's fine. He interprets it in different ways. But the smoke, then, the cloud that covers the fire is a sign of Christ's humanity. The fire is his divinity, or the Logos. And then the fire that shoots forth from him is going to be the Holy Spirit that proceeds from the Logos, and or the charity, for example, that the Holy Spirit, Romans 5:5, pours into our heart. And so
Yeah.
the image of the Old Testament inauguration of the cult for him is going to be an image of Christ pouring forth fire, pouring forth, the material that makes the church, pouring forth the thing that's going to turn you into a living sacrifice. And then he's also going to tie that in with like the image of the church coming forth from sleeping Adam's side. And then there's a whole nuptial mysticism in his thought that converges with his sacrificial thought. And you see that like in Ephesians chapter 5, for example, when St. Paul starts talking about how the goal of Christ's sacrificial offering is to make his bride ready for him, spotless and without blemish, which is now Old Testament sacrificial language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he's going to take all of that and merge it with like Ezekiel's image of the river pouring forth from the side of the temple. And all of this, he's going to join to the image of Christ on the cross with his pierced side. And remember, John stops, breaks the fourth wall, looks at the viewer and says, I saw this with my own eyes. Blood and water came forth from his side. And then the church father is going to take that and like, blood and water, eh? Well, that's a symbol of that. It points to Christ, it points to baptism in the Eucharist. And that's by which he forms and sanctifies his church and makes her pure and holy. And Shaven's going to say, yep, and that also makes you a living sacrifice. And so he's going to look for all the origins of the origins of sacrificial cult in Leviticus are going to be an image then of the founding of the church and the establishment of the ecclesial sacrifice and her sacraments. What are the purpose of the sacraments? I mean, among other things, they communicate grace to souls, which turns you into a living sacrifice, like Romans 12, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
And okay, so that's kind of the next move. And so I think that's nice.
Well, I'm sitting here basking in it. It's just
Yeah,
lovely.
I think that's nice.
And I love too about the burning of the sacrifice on the altar, creating this pleasing aroma that rises up to the heavens.
Oh yeah, in the Vulgate, the odor suavitatis,
Yeah,
and,
yeah,
and so Shaban's he's going to put his primary emphasis not, for example, on the slaughter, which is where a lot of interpreters put it, but on the ritual burning. And I think a lot of
yes,
interpreters put it there, I mean, for a couple of reasons, but one of them is if they're Christians, they're looking at Christ's cross as the perfect sacrifice. And so, okay, Shaven, if the burn-in is the sacrifice, what do you do with the cross? And so he's got, I walk you through this, but he's got all these complicated ways to explain this. But here's the idea in a nutshell. He thinks the sacrifice of the cross is a burnt offering, consumed by
yeah,
divine fire, and it's offered through fire. Because otherwise, what do you end up with? You have the Romans, kind of like performing a state execution, and that don't make a holy work.
yeah,
But on the other hand, for Scheeben, you have
Yeah.
providence arranging this, through that mysterious way that he governs, all of our actions, including somehow our sinful ones, pressing them into the service of other goods, which would look, I wrote something on predestination recently. I don't understand any of that. Okay. Well, sometimes Larry, we just don't like for a collected essay book. I had to write on predestination, and I was just like, gosh, there's tensions here that are just explosive.
Yeah.
Anyways,
I
so
go ahead.
oh, so he's going to arrange the circumstances of his slaying, and then those are going to be kind of the material conditions under which they can be informed by what? By his charity. And so the principal sacrificial agency for Scheeben is Christ's charity. And
Okay.
then that's
Yes.
consuming from the inside out. And then Scheben's going to liken Christ's crucifixion in one passage in Dogmatics 5:2. And for those of you that are watching on screen, this is the major text in the Dogmatics where he talks about sacrifice. I mean, it's scattered all over the place, but this is the big text. And this is one of my 10 desert island books.
Yeah. Handbook of Catholic Dogmatics. And
Yeah.
which volume is that?
5:2.
5.2.
There's 8
Yes.
volumes in English, and this is 5:2.
Okay. Very
So look,
good.
this is a nice fat little volume. But
Another huge book.
yeah, another huge book. But in that book, he's going to say, okay, you can take a vessel and you can break it by smashing it. What's another way you can break it? You can pump gas into it, and then its expansive, effusive force will eventually shatter it from the inside out. He's like, that's what Christ is like on the cross. He's shattered from the inside out by his charity. And so he kind of cuts the cord here, and he says, like, no, I'm still standing by my altar fire burnt offering kind of paradigm. And the crucifixion it's primarily a Holocaust.
Yeah. Well, I think that holds a lot of water, actually. I think it makes a lot of sense to me. And I remember when I was reading this in Scheeben many, many years ago, wondering how the thing that crossed my mind then and still crossed my mind was how innovative. You mentioned that there are modern authors that are under this same idea. How innovative was this in Scheben's time?
Oh, that's complicated. The sacrificial world in Scheben's time, and in general, the theological world, and Scheben's an intense dialogue with a lot of Baroque scholastic figures. I've done some research into that world, in particular, Scheben's primarily interlocutors. Nowadays, since well, for a while now, that world is largely terra incognita. And so the person that knows the most about this alive today is Trent Poplin, my friend over at Notre Dame. And he reads
Yeah.
all of the stuff nobody else reads, and then Ulrich Lehner reads a lot in that time period, but he does more of like the Catholic Enlightenment side. And then Bruce Marshall reads a lot of this stuff. And I've dug into some of Scheben's interlocutors. Now, here's the basic moves he's making. So first of all, his two primary interlocutors here are two 17th century, when he's developing his sacrificial idea, he's fighting against what he calls the destruction theologians. And that's kind of a fun term, but he has two people in mind in particular, so far as I can tell. And that's going to be John DeLugo and Gabriel Vasquez. And John DeLugo, now let me get this out of like my hard drive into RAM. Okay. John DeLugo, late 16th, early 17th century Jesuit, he identifies the purpose of sacrifice as an exercise of latria, which is the sort of the worship, we owe to our creator as creatures. So it's
Yes.
going to be, like part of the virtue of religion, which is going to be one of the principal parts of a justice in Thomas Aquinas. And justice is to give someone their due. And so then the virtue of religion is we have to give God his due, but we can't give him his due. So we give him what we can, religion. And or latria, another term that, especially Augustine used in the City of God. And so the idea there is that we have to, give some sort of protestation of God's majesty. And so John DeLugo's position is that we do this by recognizing the sort of the divine excellencia or his majesty, and we do that by kind of abasing ourselves and bringing ourselves down to nothing. It's not licit to take our own life, so then we offer up like a substitute, for example, and then we burn it down, for example, and we destroy it and we immolate it. And then, okay. And Scheeben doesn't like that. And I'm going to explain why in just a second. Another one is Gabriel Vasquez. He's similar to DeLugo, and they kind of dialogue with each other a little bit in their respective works. Or I think DeLugo mentions Vasquez, but I think Vasquez wrote slightly before DeLugo. Vasquez's idea is we come forth from God as the creator, and the creation is an act of his, power and his will, and it primarily, and so in the virtue of religion, we primarily recognize the divine omnipotence, which just as it created us can easily destroy us. And so we recognize the contingency of our own being by offering up kind of some sort of protestation of that, and we do that by destroying it. So those are his principal interlocutors. There are some 17th century Jesuits. in the destruction category, you could probably put Robert Bellarmine too. Like, and he works out his theory in the context of a Eucharistic sacrifice. He's looking for a destructive moment. And that's when the priest consumes the species and they're broken down by stomach acids, and there you find the requisite immolation to make the Eucharist a sacrifice, different things like this.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he built some of his Eucharistic sacrifice theory off Suarez, who has more of a productive theory. And there's, a number of 17th, 19th century interlocutors in the kind of the German conversation sphere. One of them I deal with at length in chapter 7 or 8, Valentin Talhofer, who has, much more of a productive notion of sacrifice too, with some different emphases, as I recall, but it's been a while since I've read him. So Scheeben, and then behind this, so you also have all the French school in the 17th century, and they talk about like the transfiguration sacrifice or the heavenly sacrifice, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a whole conversation in which he's operating here, and he doesn't exist in a vacuum. Okay, but he's primarily pushing in his dogmatics, for example, he's primarily pushing back against John de Lugo and Vasquez, and he doesn't like their positions, and here's why. Virtue as a religion perfects its practitioner, and it seems that you're symbolizing the destruction, of the person vis-a-vis God. And so like they're developing their theories and theories on Thomas. But as he points out in Thomas's works, the object of sacrifice is God not only as our first principle, but also as our last end, the good. And the good, we participate in it, it perfects us, we move towards it, that's, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then this, and Thomas, when he talks about the good, he's picking up on Augustine in City of God, book 10, chapters 5 and 6, where Augustine's talking about how sacrifice is effectively our motion towards the good.
That's right.
And so the more we take the good into ourselves, we become more and more live in sacrifice. And Scheeben just says, look, de Lugo and Vasquez have dropped the other half of this formula. They're recognizing God as our first principle, but they're not recognizing him as our last end, which we also our last end. And that involves the perfection of the worshiper, and which is ultimately what God really wants. And so he'll pick up the dictum of like Irenaeus of Lyons, what glorifies God is the living man. So that's kind of where he's coming from there, as a kind of intellectual framework in which he's like kind of building out his own idea, which is, I think, picks up significant elements of like what you see in Augustine. Now, significant in all this too is this, and this is an important point. Scheeben's operating in a tradition in which sacrifice is it's just part of natural law, and so it exists anterior to sin. At least conceptually, it exists anterior to sin. Now, maybe in practice, since sin starts at the beginning or whatever, but so I mean, it's just sacrifice is something fundamentally good, and you wouldn't necessarily have a kind of destruction or death, for example, if there had been sacrifice in some type of paradisical order, for example. And he even thinks that in a certain sense, there's sacrifice in the age to come when we're already perfected and we don't have to deal with sin. In other words, sin is an accidental appendage of sacrifice for him. Yeah. Now, sacrifice can deal with sin because the God that we owe to render as our first principle with all that we are and to return to as our last end. Well, when we sin, we remove ourselves from his orders in a certain sense, although we come back to it in another order. But we have to, we have to offset that. We have to purify ourselves. We have to confess our wrongdoing and all of that. And we owe that to God as well then, because we've departed from his order. And so sacrifice can take in all of this stuff. And then like the burning symbolism, for example, takes on a much more propitiatory and bloody mode as it begins to signify like really the suffering that we have to go through. And that's the neat thing about human beings, though, is that through our, we can make intellectual reference to Christ's suffering. We can, like as Catholics, we offer up our sufferings for other people. We're able to take suffering and give it, and so we don't just have animal suffering as human beings. And we sometimes do, but hopefully we can lift it out of those moments of suffering and unite it with like Christ's passion and different things and offer it up for other people. But then our suffering, just it can be like a means to this glorification, so to speak. So he has room for like for like the bloody kind of immolatory sacrifice, but it's a moment within a larger natural law conception of sacrifice. That just it's for him. This is important though. Sacrifice is interior to sin, and it's just part of natural law, and so it doesn't necessarily have reference to like propitiation.
Very interesting. It's very interesting, and it shows us the genius of Scheeben here is that he was able to do what I can only call like a deep dumpster dive into all of this with in such detail, such unbelievable detail, with such attention to every piece of minutia in the Old Testament and New Testament regarding sacrifice, that his genius is that he draws out all of these connections. And that's what you're laboring to do here right now. And when anybody that reads Scheeben, you have the same problem, which is his thought is so synthetic and he's struggling to put it within the matrix of his understanding of the tradition, but he does it beautifully, and his thinking is so synthetic that it allows him to draw out of these things, I think, uh, ideas that had been lost, that were there in the tradition but had been lost and sort of encrusted over. And to me, that is his great significance. Is this he's the beginning of this kind of retrieval.
In Bruce Martin, my friend Bruce Marshall's words, I'm from an article on Scheeben, in a Supposita Novit Veter about a decade ago. The breadth of Scheben's erudition is absurd. And one of the things I think that's great for Scheeben today, well, a couple of points, and Bruce makes this point too, as I recall. One, one of the things we struggle with is like, so I just got you introduced me as Dr. David Augustine, as I recall, and so I got my PhD 3 years ago. I'm still figuring out what it is for theology to be a science today. Tell me if you know. And I think kind of the story of modern Catholic theology is, okay, we're not going to go maybe with Thomas on, his understanding of theology as a science in the Summa. So then ... And we're still trying to figure all of this out. Now we'll see where we end up. But we're going through a period where we've actually lost a lot of information. Like a lot of the mid-century greats, whether it's Balthasar, whether it's Rahner in a certain sense, although I have a very complex relationship with Karl Rahner, whether it's Ratzinger, they're operating as et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're operating as a counterpoint to an existing sort of tradition of discourse that they were criticizing, by the way, but much of which, by the way, they simply presupposed.
Yes.
And that collapsed. And so now we're left with these writings that are floating free of the context, I think, in which they were formed.
Yeah.
Well, Scheeben helps frame some of that context for you. Now, maybe not the immediate sort of like kind of trends in theology, maybe in the 30s or 40s, but in sort of the broader kind of like Baroque, Scholastic, and beyond like kind of tradition. Well, he knows a lot of this stuff. And this also makes him hard to read, though, by the way, at times, not always. But he presumes a lot of knowledge on the part of his readers of a lot of texts that are no longer known today.
Yeah, that is a problem. You're reading Scheeben, and this is a problem I sometimes have been reading European theologians and philosophers as well. You're not quite certain who their interlocutors are. You know that they're talking to somebody, all right, but you're not quite certain who that somebody is, and so you do have to kind of read between the lines. But along the lines of what you're saying about how, what they're kicking against, like the mid-century greats, what they're kicking against sort of collapsed, and so now their thought is kind of free floating out there. That was a point made many years ago now, maybe 20 years ago now, by the editor of First Things, Rusty Reno. And in his, I don't remember the name of the essay anymore. It showed up in First Things, where he referred to that generation of theologians as, on a play on the greatest generation, the World War II the greatest generation of theologians. But he made the point, though, that one of the reasons why their theology hasn't gained a lot of traction in the modern church, why in some ways it's been eclipsed, is precisely because the theological world out of which they came, and in some ways they simply presupposed elements of it, in other ways they kicked against it. That world has collapsed. And so there's a missing context there. And so I think readers of Scheeben, when they go back and they read him, they have to keep this in mind too. The context that Scheeben is, in a sense, arguing out of and in some ways against is no longer there.
But on the other hand, I wonder too, I don't know the full history here, and somebody like Trent could give you more of it. But on the other hand, Scheeben's also acting within like a kind of revivified context himself, though, in like the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, because I think a lot of theology collapsed during the French Revolution. A lot of the religious orders collapsed, and then they were kind of these were people that were rebuilding too. But Scheeben is thrust into a framework, I think, at the Roman school where he did have access to a lot of like people who actually did know. And then, of course, in the revival of the Jesuit, he was trained by Jesuits for the most part. The revival of the Jesuit order in the 19th century, who kind of survived because they were, in exile after they were suppressed. He's also operating in a framework though in which they too were recovering things from the past that had been lost with greater or lesser success. I do think that there's, like Scotism had collapsed by that time, I think, and Scheeben doesn't seem to. I don't know how much Scotus he knows directly. That's never been totally clear to me.
You mentioned in your text, you said something about how Scheeben reads Aquinas, but in and through the backdrop of the church fathers, which strikes me
Right.
as a kind of ressourcement sort of move in the retrieval of Aquinas. How unique was that, if you can remember? How unique was that in the 19th century? Was that out of the norm to read Aquinas through the lens of the fathers, as Scheeben apparently did?
Well, I don't know. Shaven is, let me try and give a balanced answer to that question.
Okay, sure. No, I was looking for an unbalanced answer.
Yeah, no, yeah,
No, no. Go ahead.
yeah.
Give a
Dr.
balanced
David Justin,
answer.
unhinged. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So on the one hand, I think Shaven is a very complicated person. I think that like the education he received at the Roman school wouldn't per se have been strictly like Aquinasy. I think he probably picked up a lot of that from Joseph Kloitkin, and Joseph Kloitkin himself is an incredibly complex figure. He's written a number of books trying to maybe repristinate is not the right word, but revive medieval theology just because he thinks modern theology sucks, and it's I might be a little sympathetic to aspects of that claim.
Yeah.
But Kloiken is, and he was a significant paratus at the First Vatican Council, I think, drafting a lot of the documents. And he also had now we Shaven didn't know this at the time, I don't think, but he was also involved in a series of really bad scandals in the 1860s, by the way. And there's all this kind of came out, and there's like literature on this. Okay, well, but he I think was influenced a lot by Joseph Kloitkin there. So in terms of what he would have picked up at the Roman school, they were republishing Petavius, and he also like read a lot of Louis Thomason there. And Petavius and Thomason were 17th century positive theologians, and positive theologians, there are these different distinctions between different types of theology. So we already talked about the separation of dogmatic and moral theology, which on the one hand are kind of a disaster, on the other hand, partly justified just because there's so much literature in every discipline now. What do you do, right? So we're all trying to navigate this together. Positive theology is going to look at like the sources for dogma and do a lot of the sort of like kind of historical and synthetic or investigation, trying to bring it together for a more synthetic perspective. And one of the things that Petavius and Thomason do is they know the church fathers, and they give, or at least in a certain like reception history, and they give lots and lots and lots and lots of like florilegia, for example, and different quotes from the fathers on different things. And Shaven has a kind of in the both mysteries and the dogmatics, he's got a florilegium of different sort of like kind of source texts for like the altar fire he uses. And well, I was digging around in De Incarnatione of Louis Thomason, and I found the Florilegium that, guess what, gives, I think, all but one of the patristic base texts that he's using. Now, I think some of these Shaven did go dig around in for himself. How widely he read the church fathers, though, versus how much he picked up from the 17th century Florilegium, which then he would have, kind of learned probably through his education at the Roman school. I know he definitely read a lot of the fathers for himself. I think it's a lot of Cyril, certainly a whole bunch of Augustine, etc. But in terms of all of that, question mark. Now, all the Migny volumes were coming out 1840s, 1850s, 1860s too. So that would have been widely accessible. And that was basically like the sources. Forget my French pronunciation, but I pronounce the sources Christianities or whatever. I pronounce French like everything I know about French I learned from Disney princess movies, Socrates and potatoes,
Sauces chrétiennes,
yeah,
something like that.
yeah, ha, 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 it's okay.
Yeah, sauces chrétiennes.
And when I read some of Shaven's contemporary interlocutors, though, they'll often have like references to the church fathers and different things too. So I don't think it was extremely uncommon, but Shaven is also operating in an educated elite as well, and in a kind of in an educated elite sort of like sphere of conversation.
Yeah.
But I think his primary access, not that he didn't do further reading, but I think his primary access is through reading 17th century thinkers, Petavius and Thomason and such like. That's my
Okay.
situation, at least.
So the question that comes to my mind, and which really interests me, is I've always thought of Scheeben, as I said at the beginning, as a sort of bridge figure. Number one, would you agree with that? And if you do, then how was he a bridge figure? In other words, we play in all of these stereotypes, and I'm guilty as charged, that
Sure.
the neo-scholastics were this, and then the Resourcement guys came along and corrected that. And, as scholars like Matthew Minard and others are constantly barking at me about,
Matthew's my buddy too, by the way.
yeah, and I like Matthew too. I've interviewed him twice,
Oh, he's a great
you
guy.
know, yeah, great guy. And he's always like on my case about these stereotypes that the scholastics were these hidebound, deductive, rationalist, desiccated guys that didn't know the fathers and read Aquinas in this forensic and wooden way. And, what Balthasar later described, his years as a young Jesuit scholastic was languishing in the desert of neo-scholasticism. And we've already alluded to the fact that this was the milieu in which the Resourcement thinkers were kicking back. So, as a non-expert, and I am a non-expert, I'm a kind of dilettante when it comes to these sorts of 19th century figures, especially. My point would be this: the Resourcement guys were very, very intelligent men. Right.
Right.
So they were obviously reacting against something. All right. It simply isn't true that they created a straw man, a boogeyman, and destroyed it in order to justify them. There was something there in the scholastic world that was not ideal, and they rejected it. Now, so my question is, what was that something that wasn't ideal? And was Scheeben kicking against that as well?
So let me approach this in a couple of different ways. And I'm only,
Okay.
let's say I'm not even going to call myself a semi-expert in this. I'm also a dilettante with some knowledge. I'm a dilettante with some knowledge. Okay.
Okay.
Before I go to the Thomism kind of bridge ressourcement angle, I want to think through something a little bit. So on the one hand, to refer to something as like dry and dusty is not per se an argument, it's a mood. But on the other hand, a lot of people shared that mood. And you read this, maybe not ubiquitously, but in any number of people that come from maybe different walks of life in different parts of Europe. And there is something that's generated this. I agree with you about that. And what that something is, I think is, one of the difficulties that we're having is, remember I talked about like the counterpoint to their thought dropping out. There's not a lot of knowledge today about what that something was. And so I think we have a hard time assessing its relative merits and demerits. And then on the one hand, we're taking other people's word for it. And look, we're Christians, we accept testimony. There's nothing per se wrong with that. But I do think that when we're rejecting a whole tradition of thought that handed on like the gospel in the Catholic Church for a period of time, it's probably going to be a mixed bag like anything. And you just got to be careful you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater with, like a whole stream of theology, because the child might be the child Jesus. Okay. So there's always going to be that danger. Now, what was that something? My experience with the 20th century manuals, and we'll come back to Scheeben after that, was this. In 2018, so I was Matthew Leverin's research assistant for 6 years, and he had me doing some research project. And so for the summer of 2018, I locked myself in the basement of Mundelein Seminary. Not literally, I went home at night. But I was taking, he has a basement down there, and I was bringing in cart after cart of like early 20th century scholastic text, works of Thomism, Jesuit works, which are also Thomist in their own way. Bringing in like all these old Mariology books, and a lot of the things that manuals are complicated to classify, because what counts as a manual and what doesn't. But a lot of things, Poli or whatever, that we surely would have counted as a manual. And I was doing some research for him, and I worked through probably well north of 100 books that we would consider to be manuals on different topics, mostly on Mariology and on nature and grace, because I was just trying to. And that was very eye-opening and informative for me. First of all, those old books, they had library cards in the backs of the books, like books used to have.
Oh, wow.
Not a single one of them had been checked out since 1963. That was the latest date I saw.
Oh, wow.
Very interesting. That right there, that's a story in and of itself. Now, the second thing is, so I started working through a lot of these manuals. Here is the low point. Here is the absolute low point of the manuals for me. And then I'll get to some of maybe the better stuff.
Okay, sure.
The low point. It was a manual on Mariology. I don't remember who it was by. And the author was arguing from some kind of perfection principle as applied to Mary, that she must have had every perfection necessary for her state in life. And, blah, 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 blah. And one such perfection, she must have been heaven adorned with all fairness, and whatever his precise argument was. And the fairest color of eyes is blue. Therefore, Mary had blue eyes.
Really? That was in the manual?
That was in the manual.
Well, the power of deduction there is pristine. I don't know how you could possibly argue against that.
Well, and I had all kinds of issues with maybe the major and the minor premise there. I mean, not that I would wish to not confer perfections on Our Lady, of course, but that was the low point for me. And I think you can see a certain deductive a priorism at work there that is maybe not really in touch with a lot of church history, with history in general, maybe with what maybe Mary's like DNA, for example, would have been, and the traits maybe she would have picked up from her parents, for example. None of that kind of stuff is being taken into consideration there. And so there is a kind of like, I guess you could get there into kind of like what Blondel likes to, I think he comes up with the label extrinsicism, where you do have a sort of like a kind of a conceptual like approach to reality, where you can just simply deduce everything from first principles, but then you're not actually dealing with the material in front of you. On the other
Yeah,
hand, I worked through like piles of manuals on like nature and grace, and some of them are from a like a Dominican perspective, and some of them are from Jesuits. And then they, by the way, the Dominicans and Jesuits all fight each other. So they say, okay, we have this thesis on the atonement. Like, here's the counter approach. Here's what the Dominicans argue. Here's the principles of the Dominicans argument. I can test the minor. Here's what I think. And you actually read a lot of this stuff, and you're just like, yeah, this is just Catholicism. And I had a buddy of mine. He was teaching a class. He's like, what would you recommend as a textbook for like approaching this class? And I went, gosh, I can't think of one. And they were pretty, I think they were, a lot of them were just pretty good introductions to different subjects of Catholic theology. And overall, I liked them and I learned a lot from reading them. And so what I'm saying though is that, like, do I think that there is sometimes a deductive a priorism at work that needs more consultation with, for example, like the positive sources of theology? I found that lacking sometimes, but not exclusively. And so I think that's maybe one aspect of it. But on the other hand, and now we get back into the question of like a mood though, too. Like, I didn't per se find them dry and dusty. I had a different experience. And because I have different baggage, I have a different background. I also don't live maybe in like an oppressive kind of postmodernist environment, maybe where people are taking a modernist oath and certain, kind of doors are being forcibly closed. And then I've heard rumors that they had like reporting groups and different things, and it
they
doesn't seem
did.
to. Yeah, yeah,
Okay, can I interrupt for just 1 second?
yeah,
And,
yeah, yeah.
and I don't want to break your stream of thought here because it's fascinating. This is really fascinating. Thank you for the whole thing. You went through all those manuals and everything. That's just astounding to me. But anyway, I would say that one of the problems that say people like a Balthazar de Lubac had with the so-called manuals
Yeah.
and the neo-scholastic world wasn't so much what they said,
Mhm.
but the conjunction of the manual approach with mandates from the Holy Office. So, in a sense, it was what you were not allowed to say.
Yeah.
That the manuals represented to someone like Balthazar a constriction.
Yeah.
And this is what he meant, I think, by languishing in the desert of neo-scholasticism. A
Right.
genius like Balthazar, who had studied Germanistics and all these sorts of things, who wanted to delve into the world of Goethe and poetry and the apocalypse of the German soul and modern streams of thought, found all of those avenues cut off.
Yeah.
This is simply error to be refuted, not ideas to be mined for their profundity or whatever.
So
What do you think of that?
maybe our thesis here then is that it's the manuals in conjunction with maybe a kind of excessively repressive response to the modernist crisis.
Yes, I think so. That's what I'm
Something
saying.
like that. I think something like that. But let's say, I encountered the manuals in a kind of a carnival free for all environment. And then I found,
Exactly.
you see my point.
Yeah,
It's just
oh, absolutely.
my baggage isn't there because that environment no longer exists. And I have a hard time, it's not that I don't believe them. It's just, I have a different experience. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. The
Yeah.
milieu is completely different. You and I too, we were raised in a relativistic culture, religiously indifferent, a chaos, a mixture of all kinds of things. And so, yeah, when I was a young seminarian studying philosophy in a college seminary, we were actually, it was a very, very conservative seminary, and we were reading some of the old manuals, I guess, what you would call old man. One of them started with the author started with a T, and its name is on the tip of my tongue, but I can't think of it now. But anyway, it was a kind of standard one. And even though, and I initially was thrilled by it, just like you, like, wow, this is like clarity in the midst of the thicket of chaos that my young life had been exposed to. But then over time, I was reading, I would have questions, and I would find that they were delegitimated.
Mhm.
That's just not a question that we should ask. I mean, I wasn't kicked out of the seminary, or repressed or censored. I was simply discouraged from
Mhm.
pursuing certain lines of thinking. And my wise spiritual director, Father Anton Morgenroth, who was a convert from Judaism and who had known Balthazar,
Oh, wow.
understood my dilemma. He started introducing me to Balthazar and the Resourcement guys. So, in a lot of ways, for me, the liberating moment was being introduced to the Resourcement thinkers, and
Yeah.
precisely because it seemed to me that they were opening up questions that the scholastic manuals just weren't willing to address. It wasn't that the manuals were wrong and weren't fruitful in their own way. It's just they weren't, for me, poetic enough, imaginative enough, expansive enough, and
I
go
guess
ahead.
I can give maybe one parallel to that in my own life. It's not that I was ever like opposed to like figural typological readings of, like the Old Testament in the allegorical sense. I didn't like, I come from kind of a Protestant background, and before that I was
Yeah.
nothing. And I
Yeah.
just hadn't been taught to like read scripture like that, though, even though, St. Paul says Christ our passion is sacrificed and that kind of thing. But I read the moment, like one of the life-changing moments for me was when I read from Jean Daniel's From Shadows to Reality. Now that's the English title. The French title is different, but Shadows to Reality. And I think that there's some defects with the book. I think he pushes what he views as sort of like the mainstream kind of patristic allegory too far from maybe some of the tropological senses and wants to insulate them a little bit. And everybody kind of recognizes that. Nevertheless, it opened me up to a whole way of reading scripture that I'd never seen before. And by the way, I think you see that reflected all throughout my book, though, Christ and the altar fire. The whole book is about the relationship between concept and biblical metaphor, really. I mean, as a kind of subtext, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
And it's now, I don't know whether Scheeben is a bridge figure between Thomism and Resourcement. That's complicated. But one of the things, but I do think of myself as a little bit of a Resourcement Thomist, just because I am kind of a Levering guy in some sense or the other. And that's, he's always pushing that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
trying to bring these things together. And one of the things I liked when I started reading Scheeben, though, was I subjectively felt like he brought me into a lot of the conversation with the scholastic patrimony, which I felt was sorely lacking today. But he has a lot of that poetry. He really tackles a
Yes.
lot of big questions in there. And I think that's going to be some of his appeal today, is that he's operating in the pre-modernist crisis, though, too. I mean, he died in 1888. But he's operating, and by the way, and he's like Newman, though, he is the enemy of the anti-dogmatic principle. He's pretty clear about this in his writings because he's familiar with this stuff that going on in the 19th century too. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, he does operate, at least in his own sphere, within a sphere of like incredible freedom of inquiry, actually. And I think you see that in his writings. And he's trying, and I was trying to, in my own way, reflect that in my book too. I mean, I have a lot of, and the version you read is much shorter, but I had a whole section on the metaphysics of the supernatural in him, et cetera, et cetera. But I was trying to bring that into dialogue, for example, with some of the imagery of Old Testament ritual burning, and then the typology of how that fits into the New Testament, and then how that relates to like what we'll call a Tomistic metaphysics. Scheeben, he's kind of a Jesuit trained Thomist, which means he's kind of like, he's a Thomist, and his metaphysical commitments are basically Thomist, except he's really eclectic in his theological positions. He brings a lot of things at the table, and this is a point Bruce Marshall made a long time ago. The way Scheeben argues, though, he forces you to do Sacra Doctrina. The way he brings his sources into dialogue, if you want to engage with him, he does historical studies. He brings all these people together. He brings people into dialogue. But at the end of the day, he puts his book down and he says, what do I think is true? What is my judgment about the nature of this kind of like theological reality or the mystery, insofar as I can comprehend it with my sources that I'm available, as it's been discussed in the tradition? What is my judgment about reality? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what theology, you have to make that kind of judgment in theology,
You
and he
do.
always brings you there. And sometimes you're going to wildly disagree with him. Like Vincent Strandiore's dissertation on the most controversial part of Scheeben's thought, his discussion of the quasi-formal causality of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Now, quasi-formal causality, that's a mouthful. You can disagree with him there. On the other hand, I think at the end of the day, he's not saying something all that much different from Thomas within his own kind of framework. But he's making his own judgments about reality, trying to bring together a lot of like Thomism and a lot of like maybe like Cyril of Alexandria on deification and a lot of different things. And he's just on all of his pages, he's got all these different types of voices and dialogue constantly. And then at the end of the day, he puts it down and he says, here's my assessment of the matter. And if you disagree with me, tell me why. I like that.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's
I
an
do too.
incredible freedom of inquiry in writings. And
So
on the other hand, though,
no, go ahead. On the other hand,
okay.
what?
Oh, but on the other hand, that does make him a little, I mean, he can be a little challenging to read today just because such a spread of interlocutors, and he assumes a lot of knowledge on the part of his readers. And so, buckle up. But on the other hand, he has his big print and his small print paragraphs in the dogmatics. And the big print paragraphs are much more accessible. So it's kind of like Barth's dogmatics. You can skip some of the small print ones if you feel like you need to, where he gets into a lot of the nitty gritty. And his mysteries, though, is like, it's written for an educated lay audience. It's not just for like a priestly audience, and it's reasonably accessible.
Very good.
So,
Yeah.
does he bridge Thomism and Resourcement? I mean, it depends on if by Thomism you mean a broad scholastic conversation that includes a lot of voices that are Thomisticy. And on the one hand, maybe a lot of like patristic thought and sort of like typological exegesis. If that's what you mean, then yes. But on the
Yeah.
other hand, I don't think those are, I think that's complicated though, like in terms of defining those different parties.
Well,
If that
perhaps,
makes sense.
perhaps my feelings on this are simply that in reading Scheeben, you are introduced to someone who's essentially a Thomistic thinker, a scholastic thinker, who lives in that scholastic world. And when you read him, you're getting, in a sense, the best of that world. And so reading him destroys certain stereotypes that I think a lot of modern theologians have, that theology was simple. In other words, you go from Aquinas to the Resourcement guys of the 20th century, maybe Newman thrown in, but there was nothing else in between. It's just a sort of wasteland in between. And that there was nothing there to read, and the scholastics were just a pile of deductive nonsense, and not nonsense, but you know what I mean, just pejorative. And so you read Scheeben and you realize, you know what, this stereotype is false. This is a genius theologian writing in the 19th century, mid to later 19th century, and he sort of ruptures those stereotypes while at the same time having innovative insights into things that I think are astounding. And those innovative insights are actually the product then of that sort of scholastic framework in which he's working, which once again disproves a certain stereotype about Thomistic thinkers, that they weren't capable of such innovation, such insights. Anyway, I'm rambling now, but those are my impressions as I read the Mysteries of Christianity.
Yeah, and and I'm like, we've all been exposed to all those stereotypes. I've never personally like held those myself. I mean, I've heard them. I've never personally held them myself though, and I'm not sure why that is. Partly it's because I really started getting into Catholic theology after about 2009, and we existed in a totally different world when
Yeah.
that stuff was circulated, like when you were younger. And I also read a lot of Thomistic stuff like early on, and like when I like Bishop Barron talks about this too, what a like eye-opening experience his encounter with Thomas Aquinas was. Like when I started reading Thomas Aquinas in like 2013, and now then people can make a distinction between Thomas and Thomism, and we don't need to go into that here, but just as a representative of like quote unquote scholasticism, I really started reading Thomas Aquinas for the first time in 2013, and I guess the kindest thing I can say about Thomas is that he's, and I know he's not the only scholastic figure, and he exists as an interlocutor and part of a larger conversation that we call Catholic theology. Nevertheless, I still think he's one of the most successful, if not the most successful articulator of the Catholic faith that I've ever seen. And I guess the kindest thing is I can say he's rewired the synapses in my brain. Like I process reality in his categories. I just do, for better or worse. And so I'm Thomistic-y.
Well, I'd say I'm more Augustinian than Tom. I process things in largely in Augustinian categories.
Now explain to me because I hear that. Explain to me what you mean by Augustinian and as distinct from like Thomistic, just so I can, because sometimes people say like pessimistic or like what's particular
Oh no,
aspects.
I don't actually share that aspect of Augustine. I'm not quite as pessimistic about human nature as Augustine was. Two things, two things with regard to Augustine that I love. I think he gives us a kind of theology of history that Aquinas does not give to us, and his distinction between the city of God, the amor Dei, and the libido dominandi. And I think this is eminently fruitful, and I've mined it over. But also his epistemology. I'm not saying that his epistemology is better than Aquinas's. In fact, I don't think that. I think Aquinas's epistemology is more sophisticated. But I find Augustine's epistemology, I'll use a German word, I find it more gemütlich. It sings in my soul in a way that Aquinas is more didactic and precise epistemology doesn't. I'm prone towards Augustine's more Platonic notion of a kind of illumination, participation in the divine mind. I'm drawn to that, and therefore I just have a certain kind of simpatico with it, but I don't hold Augustine to be superior to Aquinas. It's just I like reading him.
But you resonate.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and I wonder if part of that isn't too, we live in so this is not Thomas, but we live in this sort of like flattened modern world where, I mean, there isn't any like transcendence really for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I think that there really is a real transcendence within Thomas's sort of more like Aristotelian, investigation of like secondary causes and, the
Oh, there
investigation
is.
of the world around us, no question. But on the other hand, maybe what appeals to you too is that there is that stronger sort of immediacy of the vertical dimension,
Yes.
and maybe we need some of that today. And so then I think I can see where you're coming from in terms of like resonance there. Right.
No, it's absolutely Rich. I was talking to Richard DeClue, and he kind
Oh
of
yeah,
has similar feelings about that. Although we both respect Aquinas's.
of
I
course.
mean, I remember, and now we're running a little bit away from Scheeben. That's okay. We're having a
No,
conversation,
yeah,
and
right.
I remember when I was an undergraduate, I read Jacques Maritain book, The Degrees of Knowledge, which I recommend to anybody. It's another
Sure.
big, thick, huge tome. I don't know if you've read it, uh, but he makes a very powerful case in Degrees of Knowledge, that Aquinas's epistemology, you know, fulfill. I mean, the essence of it is our thinking fulfills itself in the divine charity ultimately.
Yeah.
The degrees of knowledge, begin down here, but what's up here? Up here is God and
Mhm.
charity and the fulfillment and open-endedness of our mind in this charity. And I remember, to me, it was a real eye-opener when I read that as an undergraduate, realizing that Aquinas's epistemology is radically open to the transcendent. And
Yeah.
so I don't want to leave viewers with the impression that, well, he doesn't do, but because you correctly pointed that out.
Yeah. Well, and when we start to get into the which has primacy, the intellect or the will, and all these long
Yeah,
conversations,
yeah.
and I'm very complicated on this, and I don't know where I finally land on something like that. What I do though, I do think truth is very volitional. By the way, just I mean, it's very simple. You're watching TV at night, you see you see some marathon for like hunger on, and they're asking you to donate money. Click. Well, you just made a decision not to take in knowledge. If I'm not, you see my point. And there's this
Oh,
interest.
yeah.
And I think like, and I'm probably actually, so I'm Tomisticy, but I also think Thomas is, in terms of his anthropology, is very Augustinian, and with the wounds of nature and different things. And
Yes.
I'm slightly more pessimistic than you on human nature, but I think we have bad wills, and I think that that affects our intellects. And then you have the darkening of the intellect that like Thomas talks about. And
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And I don't mean to say that I have a Pollyanna optimism about human nature. It's just
nor did I
that,
mean to imply that you did, but I'm a
no,
little.
no, I know you're not. But anyway, the thing that, talking about, the volitional aspect of our knowing is very interesting to me. It's always, always, always been an idea that has exercised my mind. I remember taking courses in logic as part of my philosophy degree. I'm sure you have too. And I benefited from those courses greatly. I was fascinated with it. On the other hand, I did a whole year, not just one semester. I did 2 semesters of formal logic, and I learned a lot, like I said. But I got to the end of the year, and I'm saying to myself, there's part of me that's saying, yes, but who thinks this way?
Yeah, yeah,
At the end of the day, there's a certain non sequitur element to all of it. Like, yeah, well, so what? Yeah, we can now construct these grand, valid arguments and detect various fallacies and so forth. But when people actually think, I mean, even think properly, they're
yeah,
not they're not thinking in oftentimes in these logical categories. People make inferences. They leap from one idea to another. The power of intuition that comes from a certain connaturalness that wisdom brings when you know a subject so well. But then also there is this volitional element where
I'd be
people
digging around in Newman now too at this point.
yes, yes. Go ahead.
No, so so on the one hand, like in terms of my
That's where I
special,
was heading. So go
I know
ahead.
I've most studied Scheeben, but like I think that maybe the Scheeben and Newman are very complementary figures in the 19th century who I think are doing different things from completely different angles. Scheben's operated in more of this sort of like it's kind of German academic scholastic environment, and Newman is, the English are just more like tactile. you know, and Newman is operated more as an Englishman, and they tend, the Germans tend towards German idealism, the English tend towards like a Humean empiricism, and I
It's
think Newman probably struggled with that a little bit too. But you see Newman kind of trying to work out like a very sort of like kind of phenomenological view of our judgments, like how do we actually reason from like A to B, and there's a little bit of, I mean, there's a little bit of formal logic is kind of maybe going on under the hood in some of our more, some of our inferences.
Sure.
But on the other hand, I mean, what kind of inferences are we making when we go to cross the street and we see like a car coming? Well, good grief, and then splat. I mean, well, I mean, we're doing 1,001 things at once, and we take upshots of things. And I think Newman does a good way of talking about how we think like in practice. And his goal in that whole book is like, what does the old woman know? Like, why is a peasant justified in their assent of faith to, the Christian gospel, versus the kind of, John Locke's condemnations of enthusiasm or whatever. But so anyways, I've most studied Scheeben, but I think one of the most important, and not everybody agrees with me, but a lot of people do. And I think one of the most important thinkers in kind of Catholic modernity is simply John Henry Newman. And, I don't even know if at all the times he would have classified himself as a theologian, because I think sometimes he thought of theology as what he like kind of learned when he was in Rome in the 1840s. And there's a certain method that he arrived at too late to master. But on the other hand, I mean, Newman is, he's in a very deep sense, I think he's a pastor, and he's like Augustine, he's an occasional thinker, and he's dealing with the problems that he sees around them. And look, the problems in modernity are kind of like history and consciousness. And so then you get like the development of dogma. How do we end up arrive at enduring truths when we have all these changing states of dogma, and then you get something like the grammar of assent, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he's trying to think through the conditions in which the gospel is being transmitted in modernity, and in particular, since he represents the Anglophone world, which since his time has just exploded.
Yeah.
He's a very prophetic import, I think, in my view.
Oh no, I agree. I mean, you can read things from Newman in his early phase already in the 1830s. In the 1830s, where he's presciently, in a sense, laying out here's what's wrong with modernity. Here's what's wrong with liberalism. And the liberal mind. And they say this is something that people need to understand too, with regard to Scheeben, regard to Newman, and a lot of the 19th century Christian thinkers, Catholic and otherwise, is that theological liberalism or progressivism is not a construct of the 20th century. It has its roots actually in the 18th century. For example, one already begins to see in the French and the Germans, the Protestants, the quest for the historical Jesus. You get guys like Reimarus and Reed and so forth. Yeah.
And that goes back in the 17th century.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, 17th, exactly. Back to the 17th century, even.
We can go back to like John Locke, for example.
Yes.
If we look for an instance of liberal religion, I'm working on a new book right now, which has a number of, we'll see if it turns into a book or a series of essays, but I'm researching a whole chapter on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and his, because in particular, I'm, kind of like a grandfather type of figure to what you see in like Schleiermacher, for example, or they kind of, all these different people, like somebody like Schleiermacher, or later on, I've been reading a lot of George Terrell. They're responding to sort of some of the kind of the historical acid that's been eroding the sort of the foundations of like Catholic dogma, is kind of having something that has an abiding sort of like intellectual content. And everybody's like, worried about these different things. Well, people like Schleiermacher, for example, they pull the escape hatch, and then it's Revelation's ultimately non-propositional. But you already see this if you dig around in Rousseau, and it's baked right into his anthropology. Well, he's writing this stuff in like the 1750s and 60s.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of roots to this, but it goes back easily into the beginnings of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, it does. And so these grand 19th century figures that we're talking about here today, Newman and Scheeben and a few others, they're worth, what I'm trying to say is they're worth reading precisely because they're not out of date. There are elements within them, of course, that are dated, but they're not in any way out of date, because the ideas with which they are wrestling are simply in ideas in their seed form that have just exploded today. So they are as relevant now as they ever were. In fact, maybe even more so, because they're addressing it at its roots.
Scheeben and Newman are dealing with in seed form. They're just dealing with the problems that we're dealing with today. And these problems have gotten worse. But then that means that the thinkers also that are engaging with these things when they're sort of like in their seed form can sometimes give us a clearer perspective on their trajectory, I think.
Yeah.
Because we as a church right now, we have a lot of problems and we're trying to grapple with in relation to the modern world, in which and that's the whole problem that Vatican II is trying to address. If we can go on a tangent, it's not
No,
that I want
please.
I don't want your readers per se to read heretical literature without all of the necessary caveats on this, but the most eye-opening book, one of the most eye-opening books I've ever read is actually by the Jesuit George Tyrrell, excommunicated during the modernist crisis. His
Yeah.
19, oh, there's a number of works that you should read, but his 1908 book, Medievalism, what that is Cardinal Mercier over in Belgium had called out that awful modernist George Tyrrell in like some kind of Lenten pastoral. And then George Tyrrell's like, really? I don't live in your diocese, at least Pius X had the decency not to mention me by name. And so fine, you want to call, I mean, he writes a book length response to this guy. But here's what I'm going to say. I disagree with the vast majority of positions that George Tyrrell takes on almost every issue. And that's because I have a fundamentally different understanding of the relationship of revelation, of what the intellect can and can't do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to see where the 20th century is kind of like going, read the Medievalism by George Tyrrell. The whole century is in that book. The Second Vatican Council is dealing with all the issues he's dealt with there. All the Resourcement thinkers are trying to, well, some more successfully than others. I think Ratzinger more successfully. I think Rauner less successfully. But they're trying to deal with the types of questions that George Tyrrell is raising in a book like that without becoming George Tyrrell. I don't think Ratzinger becomes George Tyrrell. I worry that Rauner does.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think that's actually a brilliant way of framing those two thinkers, because oftentimes it's forgotten that these guys were not writing in a vacuum. Ratzinger, Rahner, Balthasar de Lubac, Danielou, all these, they're not writing in a vacuum. There are ideas swirling around, and certainly the ideas raised in the modernist crisis by people like George Tyrrell are front and center in the minds of people like a Ratzinger and a Rahner and so forth.
And Tyrrell he's just a great writer. Like
Yeah, he is.
we didn't disagree about everything. I probably could have been friends with him. So,
Oh, I'm sure he was actually, as we say these days, I'm sure he was a great guy. I probably sit down and have a beer with the dude. But I'm like you. I've read him, and I think great writer. He raises all the right questions, and then, in my opinion, comes up with all the wrong solutions.
well, he
But he,
pulls the non-propositional escape hatch because he can't reconcile like the historical critique with dogma, and that's the kind of the problem of intrinsicism and extrinsicism you see in Blondell's writings, for example, which are exactly contemporary.
yeah,
And
yeah,
what he does
yeah,
is he pulls the escape hatch to try and preserve Catholicism. But what he does is he basically gets rid of the dogmatic proposition, and or in actually any revelatory proposition, and then he's not a sentimentalist and he rejects that term, but he thinks that revelation is an experience, and then the human words that describe that experience are
yeah.
really human words, no matter how they might spontaneously arise from the experience, but the revelatory experience is wordless. And that's the root of theological liberalism ultimately. But and at the key there, though, is really an attack on what I think is the very center of the gospel, that the word became flesh and that God is able to express his word in history,
Yeah.
in the word, in human words, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and you
And
see
this
this
is
in
like,
Balthasar. Oh my
yeah,
gosh, this idea of the word unfolding God's revelation to it. I mean, this is not central just to Ratzinger; it's central to Balthasar as well. And you can
trying
see
to
them.
find nuanced ways to maintain a propositional revelation within the framework of the relationship between word and event, word and deed,
Yeah,
the word in its historical context, the question of dogmatic development and how our words kind of open up to other words over time. And all these, by the way, almost impossible to answer questions. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
good
And you
grief.
end up with the Lindbeckian dilemma, right? That okay, you've got the expressivists on one hand. All this language is simply expressivist and not tied to necessarily any propositional truth. And then, of course, then Lindbeck comes up with, well, it's dogmas are just a grammar that we've kind of developed, a language that, so he ends up with these linguistic games.
And I
And
respect that, Limbeck and the kind of Yale School or whatever they call it. First of all, a lot of people I respect were trained by him, and I want to do justice to that. But on the other hand, I've like read his like I think it's called Nature of Dogma, the '84 book,
yeah, yeah,
and
that's the one we've all read.
yeah, and in his grammar section towards the end, though, I almost threw the book across the room, and I recognize that as kind of his post-liberal approach had a certain appeal during that time period. But like when he at the end when he says that, like, then Athanasius didn't think that his language about the Trinity, for example, was touch in, I'm paraphrasing, but it was touch in reality, but it's just kind of giving us a grammar to regulate speech in the church. I almost threw the book across the room.
Yeah, and if I want my Wittgenstein, I'm just going to go read Wittgenstein.
Yeah, yeah,
you know,
right.
but I agree. I sort of had the same sort of feeling, but I'm not here to talk about Lindbeck. The point is simply that I think guys like Ratzinger and de Lubac and Balthasar and others were trying to chart a path that was none of that. Wasn't expressivist, wasn't simply grammarian,
Right.
wasn't simply propositionalism in a kind of narrow, constricted sense of, you know, truth being reduced to propositions.
And I think that's actually what Vatican II is trying to do. If you pick up Dei Verbum, the catch is that there's, I'm not going to say contradictions, but there's tensions in the text. And we're trying to look, we're in the middle of the reception history of this council. And Newman, by the way, he stresses that, like, okay, you have the text, but the text ultimately, the Holy Spirit determines its reception, and that's part of providence too. And we have to
Yeah.
kind of see how it plays out. And then we fight for what we believe in the meantime. But we're living through the reception history of the council, and it's shocking actually at times how messy it is. But on the other hand, I mean, look, I mean, the great councils on Christ's unity, and we sit there and we marvel over, like, the Chalcedonian formula, 451, except it blew up the Eastern Church, or the Eastern
Yeah.
wings of the church. It blew up, and they never. Funny story. I went to a service of the Assyrian Church of the East. Those are the churches that were like in Syria and Iraq and stuff, and they had missions as far
Yeah.
away as China in like the 6th, 7th century. There's probably less than a million of them left. They have an immigrant community in Chicago, and I went to one of their services of the Assyrian Church of the East, and we're at the Divine Liturgy. They got the curtains and stuff, and then instead of holy, 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 they have kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. Well, afterwards, I walk into their bookshop and they have a whole section on the books of the commentator Theodore. Isn't that? It's a reminder that we're very Augustinian in the West, and they have he's
Yeah.
not our soul, but one of our primary sort of commentators on Scripture, though, and I think for a good reason. And really part of the last, part of the last couple hundred years, though, too, in the church is what is the role of the Augustinian patrimony in the West? I mean, the
Yeah.
Jesuits have been pushing back different aspects of that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We will see.
We will see. Indeed, that's interesting. And we are just in the reception phase of the council. You hear traditionalists say all the time, "Oh, we've had 60 years, and it's Overton window is over, it's done, it's passed." And I'm thinking, could we please have the long view that the church always has with regard to its ecumenical councils? I'm not good. In some ways, we're still within the reception phase of Vatican One,
Oh,
and
sure. I
trying
mean,
to figure out papal authority, papal infallibility. The
what's
Chads
the
were left hanging.
what is he? I mean, that's one of that's one of the tension points in the Second Vatican Council is the need for
Yes.
papal jurisdiction in relationship to collegiality. And yeah, does Lumen
Yeah.
Gentium settle that? I don't think so.
I mean, yeah. I mean, Vatican II alters in some ways the modern teaching of people like Pius XII, where Pius XII said all three munera of the bishop, governing, sanctifying, teaching, all three come directly from the Pope by delegation. Vatican
Yeah.
II comes along and says, no, 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 no. All three munera come directly from God by divine right in virtue of episcopal consecration and so on. And that was part of its teaching on collegiality. But it was so controversial. We, of course, had to have added on at the end of Lumen Gentium the nota previa from Paul VI that
Yeah.
essentially said, forget all that. It's sub petro et cum petro with an emphasis under sub petro. So there you
Yeah.
go.
So how do we put all that together? I mean, we're still figuring this out. And then what is this actually going to look like in practice? And by the way, even if you can, for example, hold to a really, really high view of papal jurisdiction and actually have a situation in which it's exercised concretely with a lot of subsidiarity, and you might end
Yes.
up in practice within certain bonds of charity that actually doesn't look all that different than the first century when maybe a lot of that jurisdiction lied dormant.
I think a good case could be made that that is true. One of the great, well, we have to end this soon. We've been going on.
Okay.
I could talk to you
I
for
like talking to you,
hours.
Larry. Don't we have
I
fun?
know it's great. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the great assumptions of our era is that democratic structures are necessarily more prone towards subsidiarity than more hierarchical structures. And my goodness, there is a great deal of evidence, a great body of scholarship out there, which utterly smashes to pieces the notion that modern liberal democracy, with its bureaucratization of everything and its layer upon layer upon layer of anonymity and plausible deniability, that it increases subsidiarity, flies in the face of the movement of centralization, which is absolutely the constitutive nature of modern governments.
And what we're
Uh,
seeing in modern government is, I mean, you end up basically with like the federal system, and then you end up with the people, and then all of the networks of subsidiarity between them are actually rotten out. And the extreme example that would be something like what you saw in Soviet Russia. But
yes,
I think that there's evidence of like large portions of the West moving in that direction too, with whatever you want to call it, the nanny state. And if we do want to talk about, look, I'm an American and I love our country, and I'm very grateful for the constitutional system that we have, and I think that's been an incredible lesson on my life. And just that's what I'm habituated in. But, I told you I was researching Rousseau. Well, I said, I read his Social Contract and I'm reading about the general will in Rousseau. I'm like, well, where does this idea come from? And I started digging around in John Locke too. And I see John Locke talking about how the general will is just 50.1%. And then that was actually the first time I ever questioned in my entire life, though. Oh, wait a minute. Why should 50.1% determine the course of the country? What is
Yeah.
the relationship between the will of the majority and truth or the common good? And I guess you have to have some sort of like middle premise there that, it's something about the common sense of the people or something, but I don't see evidence of that. So it's,
No, yeah, and I don't either. And a good case could be made, therefore, that anyway, a properly constituted, hierarchically formed organization of some kind. I mean, it be more specific. Are families democratic or are they more hierarchically? Are schools and
they're
universities
hierarchical.
democratic or hierarchical? Schools and universities. Are most businesses democratic or are they hierarchically structured? Even are most democracies, like our republic, is not a parliamentarian system. Our republic has layer upon layer of
Sure.
hierarchy built into it, precisely as our founding fathers understood the dangers of a raw democracy. They built, that's why we have a Republican form of government, the Supreme Court, the division of powers, all that kind of stuff is a kind of formation of a hierarchy. But anyway, I'm way off on it. Go ahead.
Oh, no, no. I like talking about all this kind of stuff. I just think that, we talk, the worst thing in the world is when you get like a bad state of a question. And then you start responding to something that's already distorted and you don't really see the whole history of that. So you suddenly get something
Yeah.
like Kant, and he's got like kind of like germ, well, what's going to become like kind of just a complete idealism over here. And he's got human skepticism over here. And so he's like, okay, let me try and put them together. But what if he inherited a bad state of the question? Well, like one of the things when I was reading like John Locke and he's working on his second treatise of government, so much of it was cribbed in the Declaration of Independence, but his first treatise of government is written against a guy, I think his name was Filmer, and he's arguing for the most ridiculous version of the divine right of kings theory, and something has already gone wrong by that point, and they're reacting against really sort of like exaggerated notions of like monarchy that I don't think Thomas Aquinas would have held to. I mean, and so things get off on the wrong foot
Yeah.
somehow. And then,
Yeah. So the question is skewed. But
yeah.
anyway, all right. Well, we've been going at this about an hour and a half.
Oh yeah.
And I have to go do some things. I could talk to you for hours, David. This is great. A very fine conversation. We ended a half an hour away from Scheeben, which was where we
Yeah,
began.
yeah.
I do recommend people read Scheeben. Nevertheless, I thought every topic we brought up was fascinating and interesting.
I think
And
Shaven, one final, he's a functionally a good bridge figure between a certain type of Thomism and Resourcement. Functionally, he's a certain type of good bridge figure for people today, I think.
that's what I've always thought, anyway. And so I'm glad to hear you confirm. Maybe someday, if Vincent Strand is listening to this, I'm hoping to get him on the show. So
I think he's in Germany. Well, I don't want to like dox him, but I think he's in
no, he
Germany.
is no, he is in Germany. I emailed him. He's open to coming on, but he's in Germany and so on. And so we have to wait for Vincent Strand.
No,
But
he's a great
anyway,
guy.
yeah. I'm interviewing Joe Fessio, Father Fessio, next week, so that'll be
Oh,
fun
nice, nice,
too.
nice. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Anyway, hey, thanks a lot for coming on the show, David. This has
No, it's
been
fun,
fun.
Larry. Till next time.
Yeah, until next time, we might have to do a part 2 or 3 or something. So
Yeah,
there
we'll
we
see
go.
if you want to hang out. Yeah, on air. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Talk to you later. Thanks,
Talk to you
everyone.
later.
Bye now.